I think you should know that the events which I will describe not in great detail, but in outline to you, some of the events of today, and which I have described in 2 books, as mentioned, Strangers in Many Lands and On the Edge of the Abyss, in more detail. And both of these, by the way, are available at Amazon. I have a copy of one here, but not the other one. I also want to let you know that for many years, I did not speak about these events at all. And the fact that I'm giving a lecture today on this only occurred, I would say, in the last few years. Before that, I never would do that. But 2 things have occurred that have changed my outlook on this. One is that I've reached the age where there's a absolutely wonderful Yiddish saying, "De Malach HaMoves kitzelt sich die Piatele," where the angel of death is playfully tickling one's toes. And the second thing is that I've come to the realization that I represent, because of my age, probably the last generation of those who survived these events with any memory of them. Because obviously, as I will tell you, I was a child at that time, and those behind me were probably too young to remember. Now, statistically, I should not be here at all, because, you see, I was born with a congenital condition which at the time carried a mortality of slightly greater than 99.5%. The lethal condition that I was born with was that I was a Jewish child born in Poland. And yes, you heard me correctly. We now know in retrospect, looking at the data, that the chance of a Jewish child surviving the German occupation of Poland was less than 0.5%. So I am therefore, in the words of the prophet Zechariah, Ud mutzal me'esh, a glowing ember plucked out of and saved from the fire. That I was saved was thanks particularly to my parents, who had the courage, born of desperation, to let go of their 7-year-old son into a totally foreign environment, and to Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytskyi'i and the Studite brothers of the Uniate, or Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which I will tell you a little more about later, who had the moral courage to answer the biblical question, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper, in the affirmative. So what I'd like to do today is to introduce you, or to introduce to you my parents and tell you a little about them, and to introduce to you some of the Studite brothers who saved my life. My father was born in a small shtetl in Galicia by the name of Szczerzyc, which is now called in Ukrainian Styritz, about 15 kilometers south of the town of, which used to be known as Lvov in Polish, Lvov in Russian, Lviv in Ukrainian, and Lemberg in German, all the same place, which you may have heard about. His father was a pious shoichet. Oops, this isn't going. Oh. that's not good. My father, with my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, he was a pious shochet, a ritual slaughterer, and a chazan in a synagogue, a prayer leader. But the turmoil of World War I forced my father to leave school in the 5th grade, but of course he continued his religious education, but his secular education he had to interrupt in the 5th grade. He was 16 when World War I ended, but I need to remind you that immediately upon the termination of World War I, there occurred a war that is little known here, but was very well known there, and that's the Polish-Soviet War, which lasted from 1919 to 1921, and which was fought primarily in the villages in the Städtlach of Galicia. With the help of relatives, he went to Vienna in 1920, so he was 18 years of age. And he caught up on his education by himself, teaching himself and learning, and passed the matriculation, which enabled him to be accepted both to the University of Vienna to study philosophy and to the Vienna Rabbinical School. In 1925, he did something very unusual, and that is he was awarded a one-year scholarship to go to the newly opened Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Now today it's not unusual for a rabbinical student to go to Israel for a year of study, but in those years this was an extremely unusual event and shows both his lifelong love of Zionism and his lifelong love affair with the Hebrew language. He returned from Jerusalem in 1926, and he enrolled at the rabbinical school in Breslau, which was then in Germany and today is called Wrocław and is in Poland. Now the Breslau Seminary, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, was founded in 1854 by Zechariah Frankl and emphasized modern methods of research and education, required a secular education as well as religious, and the course of studies at that rabbinical school was patterned more after your university than a traditional rabbinical school or yeshiva. It emphasized orthodox practice as far as day-to-day practice is concerned, but promoted the concept that historical and social forces influenced the development of the oral law. These forces could be studied and examined, and the laws could therefore be changed as conditions changed. And as you can imagine, this was strongly opposed by the traditionalists who felt that the Torah was given at Sinai and therefore nothing could be changed. If you will, the Breslau Seminary was a forerunner of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, but the religious practice, as I mentioned, had more in common with today's modern orthodoxy than it does with today's conservative movement. In the fall of 1928, before he even graduated from rabbinical school, my father had an opportunity to lead high holiday services at a prestigious synagogue in Katowice in Poland. When their rabbi gave notice just before the high holidays, and they were desperate for a student rabbi to lead services on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And on this occasion, he made such a great impression on that community that they offered him a position which he then held as the rabbi of that community until the outbreak of the war in 1939. On this occasion, he also met and fell in love with Gertrude Königshofer, who was visiting her uncle from Fürth in Germany. Her uncle was the head of the Jewish community in Katowice, and they were married in 1929, September the 24th, 1929, in Katowice. Now, Katowice is located in Upper Silesia and was part actually of Prussia from 1742 until after World War I, when the League of Nations awarded it to Poland. The first Jewish family settled there in 1825, and by the time my maternal great-grandparents came to Katowice in the 1860s, there was a Jewish population of 624, or 12% of the population. Despite that, they won the majority seats on the municipal council in the election of 1866, and the Jewish population was never large, so that by 1939, there were 8,327 Jews, constituting about 6.2% of the population of the town. Its strategic location in western Poland between Germany and Poland, its excellent railroad lines and excellent hotels made it a very desirable point to have conferences. And there were a number of extremely important conferences, Jewish conferences, which were held as a result in Katowice. The town boasted a beautiful synagogue, which dominated the skyline of the city. And both on the inside and the outside, this is the only photograph that I've been able to locate of the inside of the building. Because on September the 4th, 1939, the Germans filled this building with dynamite and blew it up, and someone took a photograph of the skeleton of that building. In 1931, my father decided to edit a community newspaper as a means of communicating with his community. And this is very similar probably to the Arizona Jewish Post. And I didn't know about the existence of this newspaper, but when I was doing research for my first book, I found some copies in a library in Katowice in Poland, and eventually I was able to locate 118 consecutive issues. I had these from January 1932 until December 1936. I had these microfilmed, brought them over, then had them printed. As you can see, they were written in bilingually, both Polish and German, because it was a bilingual community. A lot of the Jews were still from Germany, left over when it was part of Germany. And in about 60% of the issues, my father, as the editor, wrote an essay. And these are essays written in a soaring, almost poetic Polish and German. Probably were based on sermons. I surmise that from the rhythm of the written language, which is more like a spoken. They deal mainly with behavior, ethical conduct, national and Jewish existential issues, the gathering storm of anti-Semitism, and words of encouragement and hope. His broad education is evident from quotes of Polish poets, German authors, English writers, and quotations in Hebrew, Latin, Aramaic, English, and French. The essays show his love for the Hebrew language and for the land of Israel, but they also show him to be a realist who seems to have had a fairly good understanding of the temper of the times and the mortal danger that awaited the Jews. In the book of translations that I translated all these essays, I call that book On the Edge of the Abyss, because these are the words that my father spoke to his community before the beginning of the World War II, but after Hitler's ascension to power, or during it and afterwards. One of the things we always wonder about is, what did leaders, what did religious leaders, what did they tell their community? What did they tell their congregation? And as far as I know, this is the only source that I've ever found of actual writings which were written at that time, not memoirs where you're looking back, but actually what was written. So I want to give you a few examples so that you can appreciate what I'm talking about. So for example, at the end of 1932, he wrote, "The Jewish nation is pressed by boundless burdens of suffering, hatred from the outside and poverty from the inside. Our youth is wasting away. Our only joy is blooming in the East, namely in the Holy Land. A silent, deep joy, a new Jewish reality is being established in the Holy Land. A new generation is growing up in the old land. The eyes of millions of believers are turned towards it, a land of eternal longing, the cradle and source of religion, the fire of our faith, our only harbor for the future." Notice, our only harbor for the future. So he doesn't have much hope for the future in Poland. Our small vial. He talks about the miracle of Hanukkah and the fact that our existence depended on a small vial of oil which was overlooked. Our small vial. Will the miracle of Hanukkah repeat itself? Will there be enough oil? Let us believe and work for it. Let us work and believe. I don't think I'm reading too much into this to say that when he was writing this in 1932, in December of 1932, things in his view were already so bad that he had no hope for that this community would exist and that our only hope was elsewhere. And in November of 1933, that was the year Hitler was elected, on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of Polish independence, and 6 years before the outbreak of World War II, he stated, "We have not yet been able to come to terms with the idea that the enlightened 20th century could give birth to the Middle Ages, a dark era of pain and suffering. But are we going to be the only sacrifices to that dangerous insanity? Doesn't that megalomania contain within itself the spark of a new bloody world war? A spark of bellum contra omnes, means everyone against everyone, the war against everyone. We have a common enemy who lies in wait for our destruction, and who at the first opportunity will not hesitate to lift his sword against the freedom of Poland, the freedom for which the nation had suffered so much and for which it fought so hard." So that again shows you the temperament which he had and how he foresaw things. And in March 1935, he discusses Haman's arguments from the Megillah, which we'll be reading in not too many weeks from now. And he states, "I must confess that the primitive, naive Jew hatred appeal of the Megillah appeals to me more than the phlegmatic, systematic, scientifically embellished expert theory peppered with Talmudic citations." Don't you sense how careful Haman is? He doesn't maintain that Jewish laws are worse or inferior, only that they are different. He does not want to make a value judgment, since he doesn't consider himself competent or qualified to evaluate the Jewish religion. He does not want to delve into whether it is better or worse. The fact that it is different disturbs him. Our learned enemies of today are not content with this. They want to defame and degrade us. First, they proclaim a sentence of death for our spirit, in order then, with a clear conscience, to bury our physical existence. In Haman's day, the Jew could escape his harsh reality into the world of the spirit. Here in the spiritual world, he could be free of all burdens and distinctions. But in our day, the ghost of inferiority follows us everywhere. Every creation that owes its existence to Jewish genius is stamped as inferior, despite the fact that humanity has hung a mantle of science around Jew hatred. It stands up to critical examination as flimsily as the arguments of Haman. In August of 1939, when I had just turned 4, the winds of war came to Katowice, and my parents must have decided that we should flee this border area. And so we went from Katowice, took a train, and we went to Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv, whatever you want to call it, where I mentioned to you my paternal grandparents lived nearby and where my father grew up. Unbeknown to us, on August the 23rd, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, a supplement of which divided Poland between them, approximately according to this line. And as a result, as you can see, by being in Lvov, we were now on the Russian side of that border, and Germany would annex the western side and the Soviet the eastern side. So for the next 2 years, we were under Russian occupation, and I won't mention too much else about that. Germany attacked Poland on September 1, 1939, and the Soviets entered our part of Poland on September the 20th. We remained under Soviet domination, as I mentioned, for the next 2 years. But on July 21st, 1941, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in a campaign known as Barbarossa, and German troops entered Lvov on July the 1st. Prior to their retreat, the Soviet secret police, which was then known as the NKVD, tortured and killed thousands of Ukrainian political prisoners. And when they retreated and the prisons were opened, their bodies were discovered. And the Ukrainian population vented their rage on the Jews. And this was when I experienced, in my memory, the first pogrom in my experience. Jews were hauled from homes, beaten, forced to wash the cobblestones of the town square with toothbrushes. I remember coming home in the evening with my mother and seeing my grandmother bruised and bleeding, but proud that the mob was not able to drag her out of her home. By July 10th, when the Germans finally stopped the pogrom, approximately 10,000 Jews had been murdered in the vicinity of Lvov. You have undoubtedly heard about the Warsaw and Lourdes ghettos, but very few have heard very much about the Lvov ghetto. Do you know why? The reason is that in Lvov, Hitler almost succeeded. And therefore, despite the horrible events in those other places in Warsaw and Lourdes, many people survived to tell the story. But in Lvov, very few survived. In October 1941, there were about 120,000 Jews in Lvov, which had swelled by immigrants such as us coming to the city. By November 1942, there were 29,000. The ghetto was liquidated in April 1943. 8,000 were still alive. And when Lvov was liberated by the Soviets on July the 27th, 1944, 823. The single worst Aktion, as the Germans called their killing sprees, occurred in August 1942, when 50 to 60,000 Jews were murdered. And it was then that my parents must have come to the conclusion that no Jews would survive. And my father, through his connections, was able to approach Archbishop Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytskyi'i, who was the head of the Uniate Church, of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, as the Austrians call it, for help. Now, the Uniate Church, which, as I said, was called the Greek Catholic Church by the Austrians, was established as a result of the Treaty of Brest in 1596. One byproduct of the Counter-Reformation, was an attempt to unify the Western, the Roman Church, with the Eastern, the Byzantine Church. And as you know, this attempt is still going on with the two popes meeting. Under the treaty, there were a group of people who were called themselves the Uniates. And that treaty allowed them to continue to have their traditions of the Byzantine, so they prayed according to the Byzantine system and their traditions. For instance, the priest able to marry, which the Byzantine can do. The Pope allowed them to keep those traditions, in return for which they recognized the Pope as the head of the church. And these became known as the Uniates, and they are between the Eastern and the Western churches. My father met with Archbishop Andrei Sheptytskyi'i on August the 14th, 1942, and asked, the reason they met actually was that my father was sent by the Jewish community to the Archbishop because the Jewish community had collected 600 Sifrei Torahs from various synagogues, and they wanted to be able to salvage those and save them. And they wondered whether Andrei Sheptytskyi'i, who had shown himself to be a friend of the Jews many years before, was willing to hide these Sifrei Torahs. Andrei Sheptytskyi'i said yes, he would be happy to hide them if they could be brought to him. And then he asked about the families of my father and so on, and at this point my father approached him, apparently from what I'm told by third parties, approached him about the possibility of taking his two sons. The Archbishop at first hesitated. He had taken in a number of girls, but he was afraid of taking in boys because we could be so easily identified because of circumcision. But eventually he agreed with his brother, whose name was Clementi. He has since been made a saint by the Church of Rome, and he is now known as Saint Clementi. And Clementi agreed, convinced his brother to go ahead and hide boys. And eventually we are told, and this figure is, we're not sure of the number because no one kept records, but we are told that approximately 150 people were eventually saved by the actions of Archbishop Sheptytskyi'i. I remember that my father brought me to the Metropolitan's palace. This is Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytskyi'i, as he appeared, approximately as he appeared the only time I met him. And this is St. George's, or in Ukrainian it's called Sheptytskyi'i, St. George's Cathedral, which was the residence of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytskyi'i. And this was a picture actually that I took when my wife and I and our youngest son went back to Lviv in 2007. So that picture is taken much later. But my father brought me to the palace at the beginning of September. I had just turned 7. I suddenly found myself in a totally strange world. Everyone I knew, everyone I trusted, was in the other world. I was given a new name, Lev Kochaminsky. And I remember practicing it over and over. So if I were awakened from deep sleep at night and someone asked me, "What's your name?" I would answer, Lev Kochaminsky. I had to learn to speak a new language, Ukrainian. I had to learn pray new prayers in church Slavonic, which is written in the variation of Greek. I had to forget my past, never to speak of it, and never to go to bathe or to go to the bathroom when others were around. Whenever there was a German raid, I had to be quickly moved, sometimes in the middle of the night. The priests who hid me took enormous risks because the penalty for hiding a Jew was immediate death. And yet, despite the many people who were involved, and there were a large number of priests who were involved with each one of us, as far as I know, not a single hidden Jew was betrayed to the authorities. And after the war, not a single Jewish child was kept by the church and not returned to the community. I spent the next 2 years in an orphanage in a monastery in a small village in Univ. And this is a photograph of this monastery, which was built in the 14th century, as a picture that I took in 2007. A very beautiful place in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. This was our cerkva, as we called it, or church. And again, these photographs were taken in 2007. There were 2 other children in this monastery orphanage, in addition to me. I'm very fortunate that sometime in 1943, somebody, for reasons unknown to me, decided to take a photograph of the entire group. And over there is Brother Daniel, who is in charge of the children, who I remember well and who has been honored by Yad Vashem. And most of these children are Ukrainian children. But there are 3 Jews here. First of all, where the arrow is, that's me. Oh, you can't see the arrow. Okay, this one right here. And you see these 3 here? I'm the one behind, okay? And you see me in a Ukrainian national shirt. This is a typical Ukrainian national shirt. My hair is shorn. I don't look very happy. In front of me, on my right and on my left, are 2 other Jewish children. Now, I knew they were Jews. I have no idea why I knew they were Jews, but I knew they were Jews. And after I left the monastery and came to the United States and so on, I always was looking for these 2 boys and wondered what happened to them. I remembered one of them, and that was the one in front of me to my left. And his name, I remembered, was Amarant, his last real name. He may have told me, he must have told me at one time, I don't know. But it was in my mind, Amarant. His first name, I only knew Ukrainian, Dorko. His name today is Oded Amarant. And finally, in the 1990s, I was able to locate him in Israel. Long story of how, but I was able to locate him. He is a air conditioning and heating engineer in Israel. And he had a very interesting history too, because he was actually born in Palestine. His parents made Aliyah in the 1920s. They came to Palestine in 1939. They decided to visit the grandparents with their grandchild. And they went back at the end of the summer because they had to work. And the grandparents must have said, why don't you leave Oded here and we'll get him back to you. And then the war broke out. So that's his story. Now the young man in front of me to my right, he was more difficult to find, but I finally did find him. And his name is Daniel Adam Rotfeld. The name probably means nothing to any of you, but if I were today in Poland and I was speaking to a Polish audience and I mentioned the name of Daniel Adam Rotfeld, half the people would stand up. He remained, no one knew that he was in the monastery, and so he remained there. He wasn't claimed by anyone. And then the Russians decided that all former Polish citizens could be repatriated to Poland, and so he was sent to an orphanage in Poland. He was then 12. He found the conditions in the orphanage appalling, and so he walked back from Krakow, back to Ukraine, and back to the monastery. Finally, he was repatriated again to under much better conditions. And the head of the orphanage this time recognized the talents that he had and encouraged him, and he eventually went to the university. He studied international law. He is today a professor at Warsaw University. He is a former foreign minister of Poland and is today one of the most highly respected international relations people that Poland has. He's written a number of books on international relations, and my wife and I were fortunate to have been able to go to Poland and stay with him and spend time with him. Now, unknown to us, there was another little boy who was hidden. We went to school part of the day, and by a private tutor by the name of Duke. And then the rest of the time we worked on the farm, because the monastery was a self-sustaining monastery. We had animals, we had sheep, cows, and we did anything that needed to be done on the farm. Milked cows, took the sheep to pasture, piled up dung so it could be spread out later on the fields for better growth and so on. So all of us had assigned jobs, which we did. But unknown to us, on the attic of our teacher of Duke's, he had an attic, and up there he had hidden a little boy, his mother, and his aunt. And that little boy eventually grew up and came to the United States, and his name is Roald Hoffmann. Roald Hoffmann became a professor of chemistry at Cornell University and won the Nobel Prize. So I always like to say that for a little 2-by-0 village in Univ, we did okay. I might add that Roald Hoffmann, in addition to being a fine chemist, is a published poet. If you look him, Google him, you'll find a number of books of poetry that he has published, including several poems in which he remembers looking out through the slats and seeing children, probably me including, and how he envied us because we were free and he was stuck in an attic. He also is a playwright, and one of his plays, I believe, is now playing in Germany in German translation. In the spring of 1944, the front moved closer to us as the Russians advanced, and battles were raging all around us. We didn't have any physicians, but we had a medic by the name of Vitaly Matkovsky. And I'm not sure what his training was, but he was some kind of a medic. And he established a small hospital in the basement of the church and assigned me as one of his assistants. I was then 9 years of age. My job was to collect bandages and wash them. So I would see who was about to die, or if they died and had bandages on them, then it was my job to take those bandages off and wash them, dry them, so that they could be used for the next victim. After a battle, it was my job to go into the forest and see whether there were any German soldiers who had been killed, because many of them had first aid kits, and we could therefore scrounge around and get some medical supplies. And Sundays were the best days, because the families of the wounded would visit their sons. And by the way, the Ukrainians fought for both sides. There were Ukrainians in German uniform who fought on the German side, and there were Ukrainians who fought on the Russian side. But on Sunday, the families came, and they would invariably bring me something to eat. So I suddenly found myself with eggs and cheese and bread. And so I learned that one person's misfortune can be another person's good luck. Unfortunately, as soon as the Russians arrived, they were of course against religion. They particularly were against the Uniate Church, because they saw the Uniate Church as against the Orthodox Church, that they had joined the other side, basically. And so they began arresting the priests. In fact, Clementi Sheptytskyi'i, whom I mentioned to you, he died in the Gulag in the same prison as Roald Wallenberg died. And many of the priests who had hidden me were now in danger. And so I was advised to leave as soon as I could, because I was on the wrong side. Well, I don't want to go into the details, but I was able to take a cart that was going to Lvov, and I went back to Metropolitan Sheptytskyi'i's palace. And it was in that palace during morning mass, which I remember very well, that I suddenly looked up and saw a familiar face, namely my brother's. It was the first time I had seen him since before the war, and he motioned to me to come with him, and we took my belongings, including the picture that I showed you, this picture, and we left the monastery. Andrei Sheptytskyi'i died in November of 1944. He was already an old man. I think he showed himself to be one of the few church leaders who understood the situation and did whatever he could that was in his power to do something about it. When I came out, there was no one left but a wonderful woman by the name of Tola Wasserman, who had lost her entire family, took me in, And I attended a Russian school, and then the following year we went to Poland. When we came to Poland, it was dangerous, of course, to be a Jew, but it was also dangerous to be a Uniate Ukrainian. So I changed my name again, this time to Leslav Kusharetsky, a Roman Catholic, and I even can remember some of the sermons that I heard in church on Sunday morning. We left Poland in 1946 for England, and I came to the United States in 1949. I'll stop here and see whether there are any comments or questions or anything that anyone would like to add or ask. Yes?
When you reunited with your brother and the two of you left the monastery, what happened with your brother?
My brother went to England also, but within 2 years after coming to England, he was 2.5 years older than I. And the war affected him very differently than it affected me. I don't know whether that's a personality issue, or whether it has to do with the stage of psychological development, the age difference. But he never found himself there. He felt uncomfortable. And he decided that he wanted to go to Palestine, which he did. He fought in the War of Independence. He then became a teacher, and then he founded one of the kibbutzim, Lavi. And he then joined the Mossad. And at that time, Ben-Gurion had a rule that if you were part of the government, you had to have a Hebrew name, so he was given 20 minutes to come up with a Hebrew name, so his name is Tzvi Barnea. And he eventually was sent out to Austria in 1956 to help bring out Jews from Hungary during the Hungarian uprising, and then decided that it was all nonsense and he had made a great mistake, and that what he really wanted to do was to study natural sciences, the purer the better. And so he went to the University of Vienna at night and started studying math and physics, came to the United States and got his degree in physics, and then went to Australia, where he had a distinguished career as a physicist, professor of physics at the University of Melbourne, and he retired from that position. So that gives you a little bit of a background, but his past was a little different than mine. Yes?
Were any of the rescuers, in your experience, recognized by the State of Israel at Yad Vashem?
You raise a very sensitive issue.
I'm sure you'll give us a sensitive reply.
I'm not sure. The answer is yes. As I mentioned to you, Brat Daniel, the brother who was in that picture, has been recognized. Clementi Sheptytskyi'i has been recognized. We have been unsuccessful, despite repeated attempts, to have Metropolitan Sheptytskyi'i, without whose okay and order, nothing would have happened, because it's an order that goes to the top. Nothing would have happened without his okay and his order to do so. But Yad Vashem has repeatedly refused to recognize him. The reason I was given by Professor Arad, who was then at Yad Vashem, he told me that there is no question that he saved Jews. He told me that had he been a run-of-the-mill Ukrainian, there's no question that he deserved to be recognized. But that as head of a church, he should have done more. And he gave me an example of an archbishop, I think either in Belgium or France, Now, what you need to know is that Sheptytskyi'i wrote a letter of protest to Himmler. He took his life in his hands by doing that. He sent a letter of protest to Hitler. He sent a long letter, which is public, to the Pope, in which he describes the tragedy that the Jews had and is pleading for help. He issued an encyclical to his people entitled "Do Not Murder." And he saved, we don't know exactly how many, but most people think, I've seen figures as high as 200. I'm being conservative, I use 150, I don't know how many, but there's no question he saved Jews. I wrote Professor Arad back, and I said, this is not the Jewish way. I told him that when Noach is described in the Bible, he is described as Ish Tamim Bedorato, that he was a righteous person in his generation. And Rashi on the commentary says in his generation, because had he lived in the time of Abraham, he might not have been considered righteous. But given the time that he lived in, the righteousness didn't have as high a standard, and therefore he was righteous. I said to him, don't give me examples from France and Belgium. What an archbishop could do in France and Belgium, given the population that he is dealing with, he would have been torn limb from limb by his own people had he done where he was. You have to judge him by what he did within his environment. And there's no question between us that he saved Jews. So it's gone on for years. I don't think it's going to happen, quite frankly. I think we Jews ought to be ashamed of ourselves, as I've written to them many times, for not recognizing someone who did something so great. But that's the way it is. So it is a very sensitive issue.